and begin. Start the word of prayer, and then we'll get into our class. Father in heaven, thank you for this time we have together to come together and study. Just thank you for those that are present here today. We just ask that our time might be a time of encouragement, and we thank you for the encouragement that we get through your word, and just pray that our hearts might be able to focus on what we have to learn from your word this morning, and help us to always be doers of your word. It's in your son's name we pray. Amen. All right, we're going to be starting something new today. Let's open up to the Old Testament book of Esther. I really try to make an effort to balance my New Testament teaching with Old Testament, and this is another one of those occasions. So let's open up to Esther chapter 1. That's where we're going to spend our time today. Now, today and in the coming weeks, we are going to be studying this book. The main reason we're going to be studying this book is because we're going to take a closer look at this concept that we commonly refer to as God's providence. Now, God's providence, that's another phrase we tend to throw around a lot in our circles. What comes to your mind when we talk about God's providence? Okay, his omniscience. What else? Okay, when God takes a hand and what happens? Yeah, that's definitely very on point. Any other ideas? Don, did you have your hand up? I saw your hand moving. I thought it was going up. Okay. Okay, that's. Yeah, so those, his omniscience, God's hand working, that's really what it has to do with, is it's not really a miraculous aspect, although you might argue that it is, but it is God's hand working behind the scenes, is probably a good way to put it. I look at my life, I look at where I am today, and then I look back and I really see how God's hand has worked to bring me where I am today. One of the greatest ways is he's brought me a wonderful wife, and now what's going to be 2 beautiful children. And just Desiree and I meeting, she and I both agree wholeheartedly that it really was God's providence, because I just came to preach that Sunday that we met, and as I say, the rest is history. But yeah, that's what God's providence is. It's just God's hand working in everyday situations. But you don't really realize that that's God's providence in the moment, but it's after you're through that moment you realize God was working in that situation. Any other questions or comments about God's providence before we begin to look at Esther? Amen to that, it is. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. No, that's a good comment. Is God's providence is a very joyful thing when you come to that realization that God was working in whatever situation. And I think Esther is a great example of that. Now, today what we're going to be doing is just laying some groundwork for what we're going to be studying in the coming weeks. Esther is a really great book to study about God's providence. Now, one thing that sets Esther apart from other books of the Bible is that God's name is not mentioned in this book, not even once. Now, we could speculate all day onto what that is, as to why that is. But what you do find when you read and study Esther is that God is working behind the scenes in the things that happen in this book. And so what we're going to spend time doing is we're going to, in the coming weeks, is we're going to look at various passages in the book of Esther and see how God's providence is seen at work in the events that are described in those passages. Like our study in Proverbs was, our study in Esther is also going to be of a topical nature. And with that being said, what we're going to do is look at various concepts and various topics, using that word, that are found in this book and see what God's providence has to do with or applies to those concepts. But again, we're laying groundwork today. So in order to begin our study of these things, I think what we have to do first is gain some understanding as to the historical background of the book of Esther. So we're not going to get into the topics today. We're just going to look at some background of the book of Esther. So we have to look at various details as to the background of the book. And one of those is the historical details. One of those details that we have to look at is who wrote or recorded for us the events that are recorded in this book. Now, as with a few other books of the Bible, there is no clear author to Esther. As a result, many suggestions have been made. One of the suggestions that have been made as to who penned this book was Ezra, from where we get the book of Ezra, the Ezra and Nehemiah books. Another author that has been suggested is Mordecai, who's Esther's uncle in this book. And there's been a number of other people suggested, but the point is, we don't know for sure who wrote this book. The second historical detail we need to know about Esther is when it was written. Like the author, there's no clear date as to when this book was written. And the reason for that is because there's no clear author. If we knew the author, we could probably gauge some idea as to when it was written, but we don't have that information available to us. And another important detail we need to consider in our study of this book is the why. Like any other book of the Bible, we need to determine some kind of purpose as to why this book was written. And like the previous two details, again, there's no clear reason as to why this book was written. And just to contrast a little bit, we're looking at John on the Sunday morning service. In John, there is a clear purpose described, to bring others to a faith in Christ. We see that in John 20, 30, 31. Esther does not have that kind of statement that we might call a purpose statement. But we can speculate some ideas. When we read the book of Esther, one main reason it appears to have been written is to show that God cares for his people. Again, the name of God is not mentioned once, but you do see how God is working in the difficult circumstances his people face in this book. And again, that's why Esther is a great book to study about God's providence. A second reason as to the why of this book that has been proposed is to inform its readers how the Jewish festival of Purim originated. I'm not going to get into what Purim is, but there is some information as to how that festival came about. And we find that information in verses 24 through 28 of chapter 9. Both reasons that I just mentioned are possible, and they are true to the text of Esther. Now, all of that is what brings us into the text of Esther itself, but I'll pause here. Any questions or comments before we get into the text? Elaine? Right. Yeah. I mean, you can get an idea of the when things happened, but how long after these things were recorded is what we can't. And we're going to talk a little bit about the timing when we get into the text. So that's a good question and a good point. Because, a lot of the things that happen in this book can be traced back through world history. and we'll talk a little bit about that as we get into the text. Any other questions or comments? Okay. So, what we're going to do today as we get into the text, in order to prepare our minds for the things we're going to be looking at, are the two main details that are found in the historical background of Esther. Now, we're going to be taking what I'm calling a whirlwind tour through the entire first chapter of Esther today. Now, so we're not necessarily going to be going verse by verse, but we are going to look at the big picture of this chapter. We're going to look again at two historical details from the text. The first one that we're going to be looking at in verses 1 through 8 is that the events of this book take place during the rule of who the text calls King Ahasuerus, one of those difficult names to pronounce. The second historical detail that we'll look at is in verses 9 through 22, that the events of this book took place because of the actions of Queen Vashti. And we'll take a closer look at them. But what we'll learn, the application we'll take from these things, is that God's providence is a concept that refers to God working through everyday circumstances in order that his will might be done. So we'll take these a chunk at a time. If somebody wouldn't mind reading verses 1 through 8, and then we'll look at the text. All right, we'll pause there. Thank you, Dean. So again, what we see from verses 1 through 8 is that the events of this book took place during the rule of King Ahasuerus. Again, we're going to be going through this pretty quickly. So the account of this rule is introduced with the writer of Esther giving us some what I'm calling biographical details about this king in verses 1 through 4. Now, the first thing I think we should understand is that this King Ahasuerus is the king that history knows as King Xerxes the First. Now, with this in mind, what we learn from verse 1 is that he reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. That's just a way of saying that he ruled over these countries, which at this time consisted of 127 provinces, but another word for that would be districts. So following this, verse 2 tells us that the center of this rulership was from the citadel in Susa. Can anyone tell me what a citadel is? It's kind of a fancy word. Yeah. And Don's exactly right. It is like a fortress type thing. It's a very fortified area, typically set above a city, which in this case is Susa, which today is a place in southwestern Iran. And so it's this king who ruled from a fortified area. We're told in verses 3 and 4 that he hosted a banquet in his third year of rulership for the people described in verse 3. Now, what did he do at that banquet according to verse 3? Okay, and what did he do at that feast? Okay, he gave it to everyone. Any other observations as to what he did at that banquet in verse 3? What did he display? His riches, his wealth. So, and that was for a total of 180 days. So this was a very big deal. So he hosted a great meal for those who served him and did so for the purpose of displaying his wealth. Anything else in verses 1 through 4? So going on into verses 5 through 8, the writer of Esther goes on to tell us that in addition to hosting a meal for those who directly served him, he also hosted a 7-day meal for the rest of the people in his kingdom. Now, when we read these verses, what we should see is that the reason for this meal was for the same reason, displaying his great wealth. But what also seems to be happening, however, based on what we read in verse 8, is that this was a time that the people present would be able to enjoy themselves, because verse 8 tells us that there was no compulsion. People could do as they pleased in the way they conducted themselves at this banquet. So, putting all this together, this tells us that the events of this book took place during the rule of this king Ahasuerus, or Xerxes. So again, in these verses, the author is laying groundwork for the story of Esther by telling us who was ruling in this part of the world when the events of this book took place. Now, if historians are correct, the events of Esther would have taken place somewhere between 485 and 465 BC, because that was the general time frame at which King Xerxes I would have been in power, ruling this part of the world. Questions or comments on verses 1 through 8? All right. Now, these things bring us to the second background detail we should know about the book of Esther. And the point, again, that we're going to be looking at is that the events of Esther take place because of the actions of Queen Vashti. I know it's a longer section. I'll go ahead and read this text so we can get it in our heads. Beginning in verse 9 of chapter 1, we read, Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the palace, which belonged to King Ahasuerus. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, Carcass, and the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown in order to display her beauty to the people and the princess, for she was beautiful. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command delivered by the eunuchs. Then the king became very angry, and his wrath burned within him. Then the king said to the wise men who understood the times, for it was the custom of the king, so to speak, before all who knew law and justice, and were close to him, Karshina, Shethar, and Matha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsena, Memucan, and the 7 princes of Persia and Media, who had access to the king's presence and sat in the first place in the kingdom. According to law, what is to be done with Queen Vashti, because she did not obey the command of King Ahasuerus delivered by the eunuchs. In the presence of the king and the princess, Memucan said, Queen Vashti has wronged not only the king, but also all the princes and all the peoples who are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's conduct will become known to all the women, causing them to look with contempt on their husbands by saying, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought into his presence, but she did not come. This day the ladies of Persia and Media, who have heard of the queen's conduct, will speak in the same way to all the king's princes, and there will be plenty of contempt and anger. If it pleases the king, let a royal edict be issued by him, and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media so that it cannot be repealed, that Vashti may no longer come into the presence of King Ahasuerus, and that the king give her royal position to another who is more worthy than she. When the king's edict, which he will make, is heard throughout all his kingdom, great as it is, then all the women will give honor to their husbands, great and small. This word pleased the king and the princes, and the king did as Memucan proposed. So he sent letters to all the king's provinces, to each province according to its script, and to every people according to their language, that every man should be the master in his own house, and the one who speaks in the language of his own people. So, beginning in verse 9, we read about another banquet that takes place, and that is a banquet given by Queen Vashti. Now, who did she give this banquet for, according to verse 9? The women who were in the palace. So, she hosted a great meal. That's what a banquet is. Now, outside of Esther, there is nothing for certain that is known about this queen, except for the fact that some have unsuccessfully tried to identify her with another queen named Amistris, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. But again, that was an unsuccessful attempt. And this has led to the belief that this king had many queens, not just Queen Vashti, but he might have had multiple queens. And that's by virtue of the fact that these women lived in his palace. But again, that's just somebody's opinion. Questions or comments on verse 9? Okay. So, going on into verses 10 and 11, the writer of Esther records for us a command from the king. What was his command? According to those verses, what did the king want? Okay, for her to come and entertain the guest. Why? She was lovely to look at. She was beautiful, the text says. So, he was drunk too. Yeah. It says he was merry with wine, which is a way of saying he was probably drunk. That's true. On the seventh day, he definitely had been drinking a while. Yeah. Absolutely. That's a good way to put it. He was wrapped up in show and tell. So if we're counting the 180 days, this might be the 7th of the 180 that this happened. It says, bring the queen. I have a beautiful queen here. I want to show her off, in addition to the wealth. Yeah, absolutely. That would be implied in the text. Right. That's true. That's true. Right. Yeah. Yeah, probably. Yeah, there could be a political aspect to that. But the picture that's being painted here is just he's going to make a public display of her. So, wearing the royal crown. And so, yeah, so You make good points, Don, for sure.
Which offhand wouldn't seem to be wholly unreasonable. I mean, she's queen for, that's one of the reasons she's queen is to, kind of like the president's wife. I mean, they do public events and things like that. And this is certainly a public event in this case.
Absolutely. Yeah. So how does the queen respond?
Very badly, it turned out.
Very badly. She refuses. Now, there's any number of reasons why, but she refuses. Yeah.
So it must have been worse to go there than it was based what was going to happen after.
Yeah, that's probably true. It was probably, in her mind, worse to go there. Now, the text, okay, I didn't want to get too far off on this tangent, but I'm going to. The text says she was going to wear her royal crown. Now, because it says that, there are some who have suggested she was going to be wearing only the royal crown. In other words, the possibility exists that he was going to present her wearing nothing but the royal crown. Again, that's just opinion. But if that's the case, this probably crossed her mind, which might be that good reason as to why she refused.
Why would that be thought?
Because that was part of the culture at the time.
That's why I asked the question.
Yeah, it's a good question to ask.
So that was part of their culture.
In that men would, in this position, would make public displays. Because and at this time, and a lot of time after, the women were seen as property. And that spilled over into American history when you look back. That might be the case. Yeah, that she could have had done this before.
This is, of course, way off, but it's interesting that you mentioned American history. Actually, that was not uncommon, I think, for the world in general at that time.
Yeah.
It's only in the last century or so that men and women have gotten on much more even par than they were back then.
Yeah, that's
Just think of the
true.
women's right to vote that came in the early 1900s. I don't know what date.
I don't remember either.
19,
Yeah.
maybe 1920. So it would have been around 1920 or so, or 18 or something like that. So yeah, that's a good point. But there's been quite a change between that point in time.
So, well, yeah, when we put verses 9 through 11 together, just the main point that I think the author wants us to see is that she refused. Now, what happens in verse 12? How does the king respond to this? He's furious, very angry, and the text says his wrath is burning within him. His intoxication might have had something to do with this.
I mean, a logical person would find out why she didn't want to come.
Yeah, but for whatever reason, it's not recorded for us. The reason as to why she refused, but he wasn't happy with this. So now again, why she chose to do this is unclear, but something else we should understand is that disobeying the command of a king at this time, very serious offense. And in Vashti's case, when we read on, we obviously see it'll result in her removal as queen, but she could have very well been executed for this. Because you disobey the king, you're in big, big trouble. So that might be one reason he would have become angry. But yes, Pam made a very good point, is that in her mind, if she'd gone through with this, that would probably be worse off than disobeying the king. And so that's why it's been said that she really displayed great courage in just that refusal. So it's for this reason, in addition to that, as some have said, that what Queen Vashti does predicts the courage of Esther in some of the situations she would find herself in after she would become queen in Vashti's place. Anything else on verses 1 through 12 before we get into verses 13 and following? Okay. So, coming into verses 13 through 22, what the author records for us is a conversation that takes place between the king and individuals that verse 13 calls wise men. Now, when you read those verses, what's the purpose of this conversation? What does the king want to determine? Exactly. What should I do with her? What should I do about the situation that she's refused to obey what I've said? Now, also, when we read these verses, another thing we should see is that these wise men of verse 13, they really appear to be lawyers. Now, why can we assume that from the text of verse 13? What does verse 13 tell us about these wise men? Experts in matter of law and justice. So they seem to be lawyer-type people. Now, also, what does verse 14 tell us about the relationship with the king? They were closest to him. At least in the American Standard says they had access to the king's presence and sat in the first place in the kingdom. So they had a very close relationship with the king. So with all that in mind, it's when we get to verse 15 that the king asks, according to law, what is to be done with Queen Vashti, because she did not obey the command of King Ahasuerus delivered by the eunuchs.
So these 7 princes lawyers also? I was thinking in a quick reading that there was lawyers and there was the 7 princes, but reading it slower, I don't know if that's the case. It seems almost
I
like it was the 7 princes, period, and they were the experts in law and princes.
That's possible. They might be one and the same.
Reading that, I couldn't.
But he had a lot of people under him that were serving him, but he might be turning his attention just to this group. But the princes might be the same people because of how close they were to the king. We can't know for certain, but that's a good question. So again, he wants to know, as Elaine put it, what am I to do with this woman? Anything else up to verse 15 before we look at the response to the question? Okay. So it's in verses 16 through 20, one of these lawyer-type people respond to the king's question. Now, when we read through these verses, the first thing we notice in verse 16 is that the lawyer who speaks up, what does he believe, according to verse 16? In his mind, what did Queen Vashti do? Yeah, it's a hard name to pronounce. But yeah, he's basically saying, he didn't only do this to you, king, but her actions have an effect on the whole kingdom. Anything else on verse 16? So going on into verses 17 and 18, he begins to describe the consequences, and what's said there has the idea that the queen's disobedience would cause basically a rift in the relationship between wives and their husbands, where there, what the text says, would be plenty of contempt and anger between wives and their husbands. Now what that tells us something more about the culture. Women were expected to obey their husbands without question. Again, women were seen as property at this time. Questions or comments on that? Okay. I know we're moving pretty quick. Now, what's the suggestion this lawyer gives based on after what he said? What's the suggestion of verses 19 and 20? If you need to read it again, please do. That's it. A law that can never be repealed. When we get into our classes, we're going to talk a little bit more about that. That in this time, when something was written in the law, you couldn't change it. And we're going to see that in some of the events of the book that happen. Now, as these things serve to an answer to the king's question, what we're seeing here is that in these lawyers' minds, the law says, remove her as queen and give her position to another. But we ask why? This was to avoid problems between husbands and wives in the kingdom. Questions or comments on verses 19 and 20? That's true. Exactly. A lot of this is to instill fear in the women of the kingdom. Anything else? Verses 19 and 20. Okay. Absolutely. Yeah. They were a very powerful nation. Now, coming back to a little bit of history, the Persians conquered the Babylonians because you remember God's people went into Babylonian captivity. During that time, the Persians took over the Babylonians. And so we're moving forward in the history of God's people. But God's people are still in captivity even under the Persians. Now that would change because of the events we read in Ezra and Nehemiah, but they're still in captivity. That's why Mordecai and Esther are here, because of what's going on with God's people at the time. Now, coming into verses 21 and 22, the concluding chapters of the book, how does the king respond to all this? To the suggestion that's made? He agrees. He agrees to the solution to the problem. Now, verse 21 records for us that the suggestion was made by this lawyer named Memucan. We don't really know a whole lot about him. But as a result of that, in verse 22, what happens as a result of the suggestion? Yeah. Yeah, the letters are sent out. Well, the emphasis of this verse is to find the replacement, but also that every man, as the text says, should be the master in his own house and the one who speaks in the language of his own people. So the law is being carried out. Everybody's learning about it. But that's what sets the stage for what's going to happen after this point. Anything else? I know we moved pretty quick through all that, but anything else in verses 9 through 22? Yeah, you still see some of it today. That's true. You do see this a lot in the Middle East, this kind of mindset. So, and yeah, in Turkey, among the Islamics as well. So, anything else? Okay. Now, it's these things that set in motion the events we read about in the book of Esther. It's the things that are going to happen following the removal of Vashti as queen. But more specifically, what is recorded in chapter 1 serves to introduce how God would be working behind the scenes of these events that were put in motion really as a result of one woman's disobedience. One action sets in motion what God is going to do through the things that will happen as a and God, it's really the emphasis of all this is that God will save his people from a few evil men that are set out to destroy them. And those are the things we're going to be talking about. But God, how God does this is he works through a woman that comes to occupy Vashti's position, a woman named Esther. So when we consider all this that we've very quickly and briefly studied, we see that the events of Esther happened because of the rulership of a king and the actions of Queen Vashti. But again, these are all ordinary circumstances. Nothing miraculous about it. But that's God's providence as he works through those ordinary circumstances. God's providence, if we were to define it, is a concept that deals with God working through those ordinary circumstances in order to carry out his will in the lives of his people. God will work through this woman named Esther to save his people from certain destruction. Also, what we learned from this book is that the salvation is accomplished because of ordinary choices that are made by ordinary people that come about as a result of these things that we've looked at in chapter 1. And so whether we realize it or not, when you look at it that way, it's through our choices that God's will is accomplished in the lives of his people. Each and every choice that you make, God's will works through that. Now, you can take that or leave it, but I've seen it in my own life through the choices I've made. I've seen how God's will has been accomplished in my life. Now, these things and more are what we'll be studying in the coming weeks as we look more closely at the providence of God through the text of this book. I know we went a little bit long, but any questions or comments on anything? All right. Matt, will you close us in prayer?